Uh, I'm glad there's not too many people here because this means they're like the most interested in on the topic, and that's what I wanted to do before we start. Before I even introduce myself, uh, how many people here know Angular? Okay, cool. How many people here know Ngrx? Okay, that's going to be scary. There's quite a few. Okay, I want to make sure kind of what expectations we're setting here. How many people are expecting 101 level talks? Okay, how many people are expecting Pro Advanced Best Practice kind of talk? Cool. Most people didn't raise their hands for both. So I don't know what this means. Well, okay. Uh, Now we can start. Oops. For those who don't know me, most people I guess, my name is Meligy. I'm a Redify consultant. I've been doing a fair bit of web with jQuery and Knockout. And okay, I didn't scare you. Interesting. And Angular and surprisingly React. Over maybe I think I started in 2004. I was scared of JavaScript until 2007. There was a lead developer who was doing JavaScript with at the time Prototype and Scriptaculous, and I was like, wow, this is just magic. I would never be able to do this. A few years later, I was using AngularJS, and my blog was GuruStop.net. There was popular just for one blog post that talks about how to use drop-down with AngularJS. It was that hard. NG options. Those who used it would actually know. And then, okay, let's do Angular and stuff. And I created this user group for Angular, NG Sydney. And we usually have this thing in NG Sydney where there is an open talk session. An open talk usually means I bring some links and some tips and tricks and some news, either from the official Angular weekly update when it started, or just the GitHub issues, or just Twitter. And then we would discuss it with people, and they would, talk about it and have discussions and stuff. And it started because I didn't have a speaker at 1 month for the second slot. But then people liked it so much that it became a constant one. So this session is only going to be saved or be good if we try to get the spirit of the open talk, and we go talking together. If you have been following the hashtag NDC Sydney for the last couple of days, you will also know I'm a Twitter addict. So there is that as well. Oh yeah, last couple of things about me is I contributed a little bit to Angular CLI, was one of the 10 worldwide support people for Angular CLI 1. And then I'm not doing much of that these days because I'm doing React and Angular at the same time, which is crazy. Sorry for the long introductions, but last couple of slides I wanted to do before we get to the content is a lot of like some of the examples I'll be using are from code samples that are MIT licensed from the book Angular Development with TypeScript, the second edition, which is now early access one. So thanks, Yakov, for making that available. I'll also be sharing a few slides from Jacqueline Yin, a really awesome Google developer expert in Malaysia who is like really nailed how to show Ngrx that I thought I wouldn't be able to do any better, and I just thought I'll quote her. So that's that. Now, a lot of people said they know Ngrx, and as much as it scared me, this allows me to get a few ideas of what people think Ngrx is. So you don't even need to raise your hand. Just what do you think Ngrx is? I know it's public, and you need a little bit of bravery. to do that, and you don't need to be impacted by this. But what's Ngrx to you? Yeah, just.
I'm not really familiar with Redux in general. I think it's just kind of a store pattern where you have information that's stored among components
Yeah.
in a kind of a weird singleton way.
Yeah. That's perfect. So there's a one word I forgot to put into this presentation and would have made it much better. Singleton. If all the data, all the variables that you have in your application, they're in one massive object, a singleton object. That's what people, when they talk about Redux and Ngrx and all this kind of stuff, they call the state. I never understood what a state means. English is a second language for me. I'm not sure I get it 100%. And I was like always confused when people say Ngrx or Redux helps you manage a state. I'm like, what's state? And state is just the variables, the properties in your component. Now it starts to make sense to me. So that's pretty cool. And funny thing, if you look at Redux slides, documentation, the official documentation, they will say that Redux is just an implementation of, it can be implemented using RxJS scan method. And now I'm like, yeah, what's the scan operator even? I'm not entirely sure what that is. And scan operator is simply, if you subscribe to an observable, you get results over time. Now, if you have something like map that gets results over time and just transforms them and gives them back, scan is kind of just the same, except it can sometimes use the last result that was emitted before. So if I have, for example, a counter, which is like the ubiquitous Redux/Ngrx example, everybody loves it for simple things. You have the result, for example, the counter is now at 1, and then you're doing an increment, which means the result will be 2. So you're omitting a new result, but you're also using the previous values. And of course, using the previous values is optional. And everybody here said they kind of have an idea of what Angular and maybe Ngrx are doing. So the simple idea is that you have this one object, the singleton, and you put it in this store. So the store is just a class that has the object with all the changes coming in as an observable. So if you want to catch the changes, you select what part of this object you want, because if one component might be interested in username, one component might be interested in product list, one component might be interested in the quantity of a specific product. So you take the whole object and you get the one piece that you want in your component, and as a select, you get it as an observable. And when you want to make changes like add a product to a basket or anything like that, you dispatch an action, and we will talk more about what this means. So this action is like increment. I want to do something. So then you would look at, okay, what's my current state? What do I need to do? And then this action will call the reducer. We'll talk about what the reducer is, but the reducer is simply how do I calculate the value of the counter? Because the data, the way the select gets the data from this one object, although it is one object, but you keep changing that object, the values in this object, from the reducers. And I'll be showing you how this happens, because the reducer creates a new object or state. And then this will trigger the observable, which will trigger the component and stuff. Now, the one thing missing in this piece is how do we do things asynchronously? Because if I have a counter and I incremented, and then I call the reducer to say, okay, instead of 0, it's a 1, and then select it, that's all fine, but what if I have something asynchronous? in Redux world, the simplest way to do this is return a promise, which returns a new action when you're done with that promise, when you're done with that AJAX request or whatever. In Ngrx, because we have RxJS with all its power, and instead of a promise, we'll use an observable. And we will look at what this means as well. But let's start simple. The most ubiquitous Redux or Ngrx example you'll ever find. And I found it in that book originally, and I was like, okay, that's perfect. I need to mention that book. But after that, I found that there are you can also find it in a few different examples, like different places as well. So here, I have a counter. I'll reset the counter, and I can increment and decrement. Now, the one thing I want you to notice in here, especially people who don't know Ngrx, is that I have the counter in two places there. If I do that, and I go to Reductive Tools, maybe I might need to refresh. Oh, it's not going to work. Skip that. Let me show instead how the code for this one works. So I have a component in here. And before I show how it interacts with Ngrx, I have two buttons, one that says increment and one that says decrement. And then the value, as I said, is coming as an observable. That's why we're using the sync pipe in there. But then there is another child component. And the child component, all it's doing is just saying the value. So these two places, the first one that says the counter and the counter in child, they're just to say that I have two components, both responding to the same value. Now, in this example, because it's meant to be simple, the child is directly under the parent, so we could have actually used props as well. But what if the child is under like a few components away? Again, if you're using the username, you might have the username at the top right in there, and you might have a form that says your name, and you copy the username there, things like that. And that was why when I went to start my React gig, I went to the other senior dev on the gig, and he didn't know that I did Ngrx, and he didn't know that I knew Redux, so he tried to explain Redux to me. And the one thing he said was, you know what Redux does? It's just the thing that we use so that whenever we want to pass one value down through too many components, we don't have to go through props of each one. It's not entirely true, or like you don't use Redux just for that, and we'll talk again about why you would use Redux or Ngrx, but it certainly helps with that as well. So how would we get something like this to work? I now remember why that DevTools didn't work, because you need to have a special Ngrx DevTools module to add to this, but this was meant to be like bare bones. So first we need to get Ngrx itself. Right now there are new schematics that allow you to just add Ngrx to this. I'll show them later, but for now what I want you to look at, for those who don't know Ngrx, is you get the store, and this store again, it just wraps the data, just wraps the state. And because they have special support for lazy loading in your app component, in the part that's not lazy loaded, you'd say for root, but you also have something called for feature for if you have some lazy loaded modules that has its own state and you want to join only after you do the lazy loading. So we say for root, and then we say, okay, we want to have a property name. Now this counter state is nothing. This is just a property name. The actual state that we have is this one, like the whole object. And counter state is just a property. I could have called it app, I could have called it whatever. And then I'm saying, I'm not saying the value directly in there. I'm saying this thing called reducer. Reducer means this is a function, that you call to get the value. So if I go there, you'll see I have a simple function, and this function takes, sorry for those who already know Ngrx and who didn't expect a 101 thing. I was just, for the rest, we need to go through this quickly. So this function simply takes what was the existing state. You remember when we talked about scan? It takes the existing state in here in X, and then Y is a new thing, and gets the result. So here, it takes the existing state, and if there is nothing, there is a default property. So this is just TypeScript. It means if it is undefined, set it to 0. And then it takes action, and we will see what action means. Action is just another simple object. It's meant to be a JSON object. That's not how Ngrx does it, but it's just meant to be something that you can serialize to JSON, and then it checks. It should have a property called type, and this type tells the reducer what to do with it. So in this very simple example, you have increment, and in this case you say, okay, I'll take the old one and I'll add to it. If it is decrement, I'll take the old one and take from it. Otherwise, you just return this as is. Now, this works slightly better in React, because in React, when you select, or they call it in their connect, it will check by reference if this state changed or not, and then if it didn't change, it will not give it to the component. Angular doesn't always work this way, although it has full support for doing this as well. You can do change detection Angular in a million ways. You can implement your own, it's more flexible in that sense. But then what this means is that we can go and say, okay, I want to select this current state property. I could have also done this something like that as well. And this just creates the observable. In my real code, I usually do this directly. And I don't like to set stuff in here. And because this is, I have to get it, so I'll just put this around it and whatever. And then with the same store, the store in Ngrx is how you get both the dispatch and the select. It's slightly different from Redux if you have done that with React. And just tell it, I have this type, increment. Now, if I want to implement a reset, I could have also have done something similar where I'm here saying reset, and I could have said the value that I want to reset to 0, for example, or 1, or whatever I want to reset it to. But the convention for this kind of thing is to call it a payload and put whatever thing you want in there. And if we're going to talk best practices for a while, very, very, very quickly, you always want to follow conventions when you're dealing with Ngrx, because that's the whole point. If you ask me, why would I use Ngrx? Is it to manage my state? Because my state is complex. I never understand what complex state means as well, by the way. But the only reason you would use Ngrx, in my mind, is because it gives you structure, it gives you conventions. There are a million ways you can do application development in Angular. You can put, most people will know, okay, I will not use the HTTP client directly in the component, I'll put it in a service. But how will I get the data from there, and how will I pass the data to that, and all this sort of thing? There are a million ways you can do this, and the good thing about Ngrx, or Redux in general, is that it defines patterns for doing everything, for getting data, for writing data. For example, you'll always have an effect between your component and your service, and And this makes you think about, okay, I want an action for starting an AJAX request, and I want an action for finishing an AJAX request successfully, and I want an action for finishing with errors. So you start thinking about all this, and you start like knowing what to do with it. Now, in here, all we did was just creating we didn't even create the actions themselves like as classes. But the way like conventional Ngrx would do it is like that. So here we have a simple search feature. You think of autocomplete, whatever. And one way you would do this is first you want the type. The type is a string. It's meant to be a string because when you set up the store-def tools, it just needs to read JSON. And actually, a funny thing is, in Redux, if you're using Redux, there are some helper tools that make sure you don't use classes for actions, to make sure you don't put any methods in there or anything that doesn't make them just a simple JSON simplified thing. But in Ngrx, they say, we just use a class because it's TypeScript and we're fun. But at the end of the day, you still should never, ever put anything in here other than your payload and your type. It's just a convenience to have a class in there, because you can just say, here, for my types, I'm going, like, we usually group actions by the things that I relate to. So if you have, for example, a bookstore, you'll have all the books actions in one place, all the login actions in one place, etc. So you'll put the types in there. And because you don't want to just deal with strings, you might want to create constants for them. But because you're grouping the actions anyway, why don't you also group the action names or the action types themselves? So that's what we're doing there. The nice thing is, if I hover over this, or actually, let me do it like this. Now, the type that you see in there, I'm going to get like very Inception kind of thing now, but what is the type of type? It's not string and it's not enum. And that's the beauty of it. And that's why it works. So actually, it is this exact value of the enum. You notice that? Which means, if I say all the search actions like if I have a search action, it will be one of these. This means if I filter that the type is search success, then I know that the thing I have is exactly this one. And I can read the payload. Let's look at how the reducers are doing it. Now, in the reducer, we have the same idea. We have the state as it is now. And the first time Ngrx calls the reducer, it calls it with undefined and undefined. Okay, so when it's undefined, it will set it to the initial state, which is this thing. Nothing special here. And it sends it a search action. Now, search action, if you notice, was this. All right? So it means it's one of these three. However, keep open. If I know, for example, that it is a search, so here I'm doing switch on the type, if it is search success, you notice here I didn't need to cast. And now it knows that this is a search. This is just TypeScript being beautiful. I get too excited about TypeScript more than Angular and React and Ngrx and everything else. So if it is a success, it already knows like there's a feature that says, okay, it's or, and the type cannot be this and still be a failure. For sure it's that. Then so in this context, it will know that the action is a success and you can do this. Now, anybody here does not know what these three dots mean? I'm trying to see who here, who here knows what these three dots mean? Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Go for it.
Basically copies the properties of the state object into the return.
Yeah, exactly. So that means that state, it might have other properties other than search query and search results. So let's say when we want to start the search, we will not, if there was an error, we will not clear it until we actually get results. This might be the requirement, it might not be. But you notice in here, we will if we had an error, we'll still have it in there because that's all the properties that get in there. And this is kind of important because, as I said, you might know that change comparisons in JavaScript, they're always on a reference. So if I go ahead and say here B1 equals, I didn't even do triple equals, B2 is still false, right? So I might here have a properties of search results, and search results, they work the same way like objects. If I don't want to modify search results, if, for example, when I start the search, let's say I don't want to clear until we actually commit the search, whatever, I might not want to modify all the components that are affected by this, because if I replace an object that's going to, anything that relies on that is going to change because the thing is a different object. So that's why people do things when they say, okay, now if I want to modify only one element in an array, then I have to modify the whole array. I have to let's say we have an update. Let's say we want to update one of the results. In this case, what I might want to do is I say state dot search results dot map, maybe result, and then I'll say maybe if result.id or whatever, is the thing I want, I return something different, which might be action.payload, for example, if the action was all about updating the result. Otherwise, I just return result. And you'll see this pattern a lot in Ngrx applications because it's amp not map. Oh, that's embarrassing. So a lot of people would do this thing for one reason, because if I modified one element in the array, then I want the component that has the whole array, the whole list, to know that there was a modification. And map will create a new array, so that will make it know that it is a new one. But if I have a component for each search result, I don't want the components for the existing results to think that the results change it even though they didn't. And that's why I try to make sure I return the same reference to so that the components will check by reference and it'll be good. Nothing changed except for the ones that I want to be changed. And this is one thing you'll see in most Ngrx applications, and that's why I go again and say the point of Ngrx or Redux in general is that you have a structure, you have one specific way to do things everywhere. But because we're talking about search and we're talking about doing actions that would involve AJAX requests, let's say how you would do effects and what are effects at all. First thing, if I want an effect, then I want to implement another piece. One thing to like or not in Angular is they really, really, really love splitting everything into modules, even if they're interconnected and you kind of have to use them together and stuff like that. And Ngrx is no exception to that. So we have a much longer app module in here. What I want to highlight is we have the store module. It's not much different from what we saw before. We have two values. We passed them. One for them is the route, and we'll talk about that if we have time. And then we have another effects module, which is just how to do the effects, which is again a utility for doing asynchronous requests. So we'll go and see how to implement that next. While we are here, there's also a very nice thing in here. Let me do, if I can do very, very quickly. Let's do terminal. Let that sleep. So what this router thing does, and it's a bit interesting because when Ngrx came originally, they created their own router and they wanted the router to create actions so that you can also change your state based on route changes and stuff like that. And then Angular were like, come on, we changed the routers a lot already. Why don't we combine efforts and we just use the one router, and pretty much what was meant for Ngrx became what the router we have today. And it went through a lot of revisions and improvements ever since. But then they needed to do the same thing, and that's why we have this. And instead of Ngrx router or Ngrx store router, whatever, they call it store connecting router. And allow me to maybe, oops, NBX, NG. Who here knows what was NBX? It's an awesome tool I keep telling people about all the time. It's not a new one. Anybody knows what's NBX? Okay, what version of NBM do people here use? Okay, what version of Node do people use? Somebody's using 10. Recent stuff. Yeah, yeah. Have you ever thought about the version of Node that you're using? It's totally fine to not think about it, but not entirely on topic. But I like to talk about this a lot and very quickly. NBX allows you to do two things. Use a tool that you normally would use globally, but without global installs. So quite often, if I play with Angular CLI, instead of ng, I'd say Angular/CLI, and then I might do at next because I like to play with the 7.0 beta, and then new my app, and that's just like npm install -g Angular CLI next, and then ng new whatever. Just do it all the time because I don't like to keep being worried about the latest version of my app. However, if you run this inside an app that already has the globally installed package, and instead of having to call the whole package name, you can call whatever binary it's called. So we know that Angular CLI does it like calls itself ng, and it will just detect that in my node modules, in my bin folder, there is an ng in there, and just use that, which is pretty cool. Back on topic. Hopefully, this one will work. Yeah, cool. Oops. Nope. No. So, the one thing I want to talk about and show and kind of didn't get to show before is this thing called Redux Dev Tools. You connect to it by saying, store dev tools module, just another module, and you tell it if it is, how much data it puts and everything. And now you look at this. These are the actions. So if I look here, this is just an object which has a type, nothing special, and this is the first thing that ever happens. And it shows you what state you have. So here I have my reducer, and that was kind of, maybe the example didn't have the best name, because this is really a property name. They shouldn't have called it reducer, don't do that. But it just shows that you might be thinking, because I'm giving it a reducer, this is a reducer, but it really is just a property name, like a counter, like whatever. And of course it can be complex property like we're seeing in here. Now, the interesting thing about this is sometimes I do something and I'm like, okay, this action, I dispatch this action, which just means make Redux or Ngrx do its thing on it, and call the reducers and get me the data and the select to be updated and all this kind of stuff. So I'm like, oh, why did that field change? Why? What happened that caused that change? And more often than not, like by default, it tells you only what fields changed, which is sometimes useful. But also, more often than not, I find myself wanting to just go to the state and simply check what the whole state is like. And again, brilliant sir here said it's just a singleton object for the whole state, and that's the whole thing is. In your application, this is going to grow a lot. So here we have one thing for the router, and that's added by simply the router connecting module in here. You just tell it, okay, what property to put the route information in. So I said my route reducer, which I shouldn't have called it that, but that's what you get there, and then it gives you all this information so you can act on it. But in your application, you might have like multiple tabs in the UI, for example, and maybe even that's literally the project that I'm working on, except with React, not Angular, but the same idea. You have different tabs. Each tab is like, we might have products, orders, or hotels and flights, for example, if you're a booking website, whatever, and maybe completely different teams might be already working on that. And because each of them would have their own like namespace, if you may, in this state, and they all deal with it. But sometimes I need shared things. I might need, for example, username or some access token, whatever. That would also be in just a shared one here, and that would simply work. Now, talking about authentication, talking about HTTP and stuff, what is this effect thing about? What's the crazy thing? Let's just have a look. So, effects are services. They're just services. You see, you can check this injectable, just we use the services. You can, and just like any other service, you can inject other services into it. So in here, the constructor, we see that we inject this product service in there to be able to do search and stuff. This is where we implement the HTTP calls. So one nice thing about doing Ngrx, you separate the logic for example, calling HTTP and stuff like that, and maybe some rules on the data, from what happens after I get this data, which is controlled by the effect. So similar to the state, like when we talked about here in the select, we said select just gives you an observable of the part of the state that you want. Here you get an observable. This action is just an observable of all the actions that will be triggered in the application. And then this means, for example, let's say we do the search. You can create your own property, and no one will be calling this property directly. You will not be calling this in your application directly. Ngrx will be calling it for you, just like it calls the reducers. And the way Ngrx knows that it needs to call it for you is because he put this effect on it. Okay? And then you can say, okay, I want some actions, and when these actions are dispatched, I want to do something else. So for example, what we're looking at here is something that says, when you start search, I want to call the HTTP request, and if the request is success, I want to dispatch the success action, otherwise I want to dispatch failure action. Let's look at how this is done. Who here is brave enough to say they don't know the pipe thing? How many? Okay, cool, a few. So here's a simple one. In the old RxJS, you take your observable and call .map on it, call .switch map, etc. But the only problem with that was you would have to import the operators separately, and they magically appear on the object or on the prototype. But what this meant was, if you never import .map, but then some other library imports .map for you, you just use it. You just use it directly because it suddenly became available on the observable prototype. But then if a newer version of the library does not use the .map, and then your app starts breaking, and you're like, why was this map working before and now it's not? So they solved this by separating all of the observables to be their own functions, not on the observable prototype, but then they needed some way to call them, right? And that's this pipe thing in there. It's simply a way that what's going to do is going to take the observable value from there, calls the first observable, takes the result of that, calls the second observable, takes the result of that, operator, and calls the third operator, give it the new observable, and all of this. So actually, every single one of these is just a function that takes an observable. I can prove it very quickly. If I look at this X, it's just an observable, just a function that takes an observable. So Ngrx takes advantage of that. Now we say, just like reducers, this will get called for every single action. So we want to shortcut things quickly if you are not interested in this action. And that's why they provided us with this nice off-type operator in there, which is just a shortcut for filter that this type equals this type that we give it. Here, we're saying, okay, yeah, you know what? The only part we're interested in this action is the payload, which is like the search term. So just get that very quickly. And because the payload is an object in there, we're using a very nice feature in TypeScript, again, TypeScript, which is the deconstruction, which means if I could have just called this payload and then say payload dot search query. But instead of that, because I know what payload is just an object that has a search query, I can just do that directly, which is beautiful. And there's actually a fair bit of argument whether you want to use switch map or not in there. I'll get to that once I finish explaining. But here we're just, calling get products, which you can simply, very easily guess what it does, even without looking. It simply, while ignoring the random and stuff, it just simulates calling HTTP call. So for our purpose, just think of it as an HTTP call, and it returns something. And again, with RxJS, they decided to move everything to a pipe. So now, this thing, think of this pipe as that. It's part of, it's this time for this observable, not for that observable. So say, okay, yep, you're done, you got the results. Let's return switch map, just returns an observable. It's just like map, but instead of returning the value, return an observable. So pipe, what we're doing here is just like return. Let me simulate it very quickly to explain this. So that is just a nice TypeScript shortcut. So we're saying return this observable, which has a map, which means from this observable return this value, and then it does that. So here we're just returning an action of a success. Otherwise, we return an action. Catch error is just like .catch in the old RxJS, but because now it's its own thing, not a property on an object, it couldn't be just catch, because it would then clash with the JavaScript keyword. So here we just say catch error, do this. And now look at this whole thing as a pipe. Input, output. Input, all actions. Output is actions that Ngrx is going to dispatch for you. So you notice here, we are returning the action, we're not dispatching it, and that's because inside the effect, Ngrx will automatically understand that if everything you return, it will dispatch it for you. Here's a very quick trick that you can also benefit from. Sometimes, some people prefer if the data will affect two different things and they're copying the data, they prefer to, for example, I might want to close a pop-up and update, like if I have a form that is in a pop-up for editing something, I might want to say, okay, product updated successfully, and I might also say model closed, and it might be two different actions. And the way you do this is very simple once you know it. You simply return an array of actions. And Ngrx is smart enough to notice that what you're returning is not just an action, it is an array of actions, and it's smart enough to dispatch each one of them for you. Now, one last and interesting usage of Ngrx Effects is that you can also use it for extra debugging. Typically, you don't need to do this because if you're setting up store dev tools, that's already cool. But sometimes you might want to add an extra thing here or there, whatever. So you can easily do this by saying, okay, you know what? I want to console log certain actions. And the way you do this, this tab function or operator, for those who don't know it, this is just the new equivalent of, well, relatively new, because I think RxJS 6 has been in a while now, of do. in the old one. So you used to do in old RxJS, you used to just say to do if you want to do something that doesn't affect the data or doesn't return anything, just in the middle, like the console log in there. So now because do again conflicts with now that it is by itself, it clashes with the do in do while in JavaScript. That's why they code something else, which is tab. They're really, really fun names with naming is hard, certainly. But yeah, tab, it also has heritage in old stream-related stuff. And the last thing I wanted to show in here or talk about was why switch map. Switch map simply means if I have a new search, ignore the old search and start a new stream of events to output. And that's usually why you see it used a lot in things like autocomplete and assertions kind of thing, where every new letter you don't care about the previous ones. Now, how would you test reducers if you want to? They're just functions. You simply give it the input and expect the output. How would you test components? Like this one, for example. I'll show this very quickly, but with not with components themselves, but with oh, I lost my test project. Is this one? Yeah, cool. So if I have a component, you always use this configure testing module, and you give it all the tests and stuff. Now, you can just use the same stuff, same store module, parse, but simply you give it whatever you want. So here you might have a reducer just for this component, or you might have anything. And then the dependency injection will just work for you. The store will just work and will get you the data just as you want it. Where was the one more thing I wanted to show about this one? The interesting piece is, because you do dependency injection, you can just get the store yourself the same way you get any other dependency, any other injected dependency, and can then simulate dispatches. That's very nice. Effects can be a bit more interesting, though. I go back to effects, not this one. Yeah. Now, let's see how to test an effect, because an effect, there are observables, and observables coming and going, and how would I do that? There's a very interesting thing in here, which is, to start with, we're doing the same usual thing. We're saying, okay, we'll do the testing module. We don't even need the effects module. We can just put the effects directly. But then there is another very nice function that effects/testing gives us. This is similar to routing/testing, HTTP/testing in Angular itself. Which is this provide mock actions. What provide mock actions means is that you can have your own observable. You might, for example, choose to make that a subject so that you would push data, like push actions to it. And then, Or you can simply replace it with something else, and that will be much simpler, and I'll show you how to do this. So we were saying every time we give you a different observable for this, call all the effects, and I'll show right now just in. The other thing we're doing in here is that because our effects depend on the service, we're just mocking it with use value, and I'm using just in here, so you can just.fn is like just give it a mock object that they don't care about. So that's what this thing is. Now, there are two ways to test this. There is the by the book way, and there is the this just makes more sense for people like me way. If you ever checked something for RxJS, you always do this nice they call them marbles thing in there, because it's like real marbles. This is how they demonstrate all actions and all state changes from observables. With effects, it's slightly different. It's kind of the same because it's just a stream of observable values. So the Ngrx team, they created this library that allows you to test it similar way to the marble. So you tell it what's the marble diagram that you expect, and then this will just work. So anybody knows hot and cold observables? This is about like, does the observable directly push data, or does it only push data when you subscribe to it? That would be a cold one. So here we're saying create an observable. We're getting it from the marbles library. And we're saying, okay, now for actions, we'll create an observable that already emits data directly, doesn't wait for anybody. And this is the marble equivalent of like, something happens. This is like the red thing in here. And then we connect this A to a value so that, start with add user, for example. And then we say, okay, we expect that we will get the user, and then we will get this outcome thingy, which is just the response. Now, what we did in there, this is an example of adding an effect that just adds users, and you have a service that does the actual HTTP request. And that's why we're saying for the HTTP request, just return this response thingy. Again, it is just an observable that will only emit data when people subscribe to it, and they'll subscribe to it from the switch map of the effect, just like we did in search. But so this response is just for the service, but this outcome is what we want to get. So we're saying after the A, the B should come. And then we're saying expect that to match this observable, which is outcome. Now, if you understand marbles enough to draw this diagram, and you understand it enough to come later, 2-3 months later, and read it and understand what the test does, good for you. Use this, okay? When I was writing applications myself, I found that I'm not too smart, or smart enough to understand this kind of thing. So I'm doing it in a slightly more complex way, but just, it has more steps, but it's easier for me to understand. And that's how I rewrote this test. That's how I would also kind of recommend doing this. So now, we got the user. We created the action for add users. This is just like above, if you notice. And we know what's our outcome. I still call it outcome in there. I usually call it in my own test, I call it expected, because that's what the testing libraries also call. But here I wanted to be faithful to the original implementation. And then I said, okay, now for add user, the same way in there, but instead of returning that response thingy, which is called whatever, I just said observable of user. Again, this is just like observable of, but now they also don't want to put anything on even the observable as a static property, and you just separate it all. And then I say, okay, the effect that I want to test in here, which is add user, I subscribe to it, which means I'm expecting that something will happen. How do I say I'm expecting that something will happen? By waiting for it. So I have this done thing to be called at the end. Now I'm saying, when you get results, expect that the type will be the type I'm expecting, and the payload will be the payload I'm expecting. In my real projects, this eventually ends up into some utility that just, checks the objects, and there is also expect actual to like depending on your library, you have things like to match object, and then you give it the object that has the properties, and it will automatically do it. So I could have done that like that. But I wanted to show you like what the idea in general is like, and then once I give the actions, because so the test really starts here. So I give the actions, provide mock actions, gives it to the effects, and then this effect, and then this effect gets called, and subscribe works, and I check the data, is it right, is it out. That's one way. So that was something that I wanted to show. I think we're kind of on time. The last thing that you might be interested in knowing how to do it, we already talked about the state and everything, is why would I use Ngrx? As I said, now everything in your code becomes, I'm going to dispatch this, I'm going to select the data, I'm going to write an effect in the service. It gives you structure for your application, and the structure that is pretty popular, so new developers will be able to join and understand, and if they don't understand, they'll be able to Google not just Ngrx, but Redux, and understand how it works. Now, I kind of chose to go with code instead of going through all the examples and the slides, but I think we already talked about different things, but there is even more that I was planning to talk about, but didn't have the best time to talk about. There's another thing called entity, which is just some utilities that automatically give you things like select single items, get all the data by ID, things like that. It's relatively new, maybe end of last year. Oh, which is, now that I think about it, it's not that new. But it's not that popular unless you're using like a grid with add and edit and stuff like that, but it would be useful as well. So that was that. If you have any questions, you must stay and have talk about it. Otherwise, I think my phone's telling me that it's, we're done.